Hello and welcome back to a new episode. You know, those of you who've watched this channel for a long time may have noticed that there's a very major band that I have mostly avoided discussing when I'm not making comparisons to songs that sound like they were ripped off from them. And that is, of course, the Beatles. And the reason I've avoided them is, I think it frankly should be obvious. There is so little left to say about them. I mean, I myself own 3 separate books on the band. It's not exactly virgin ground, and while there's definitely a market for discussions about the Beatles, and I probably could get a lot of hits from talking about the Beatles, which is something that I think my very painfully clickbaity Rate the Artist video many years ago was perfect evidence of. I just feel like it's played out. I feel like it's played out. I probably will do a series on some of the Beatles albums I think maybe should be taken down a peg at some point, because there are a couple that I have maybe not controversial opinions of that I just don't like quite as much as other people do. So all of that and my complete and total inability to form coherent sentences about this band, no, seriously, if you do not want to know about the outtakes for this video, the point is, I really don't talk about the Beatles, and I really don't talk about their solo careers, although in many ways I find their solo careers to be a more interesting venue for discussion. The thing about the Beatles' solo careers is that each of them is, for the most part, wildly uneven, with the exception of George, who starts off amazingly and then kind of tapers off over the course of his career. He brings it back at the end with the assistance of Jeff Lynne, who graciously allowed George Harrison to guest on his 1987 album, Cloud 9. On the whole, George's career is phenomenal at best and just kind of okay at worst. You know, I have his worst album. I've listened to it. It's pretty mediocre, but it's not the worst thing I've ever listened to. Now, as far as the solo Beatles that people actually talk about, you know, being John and Paul, John, I think, has a very underwhelming solo career for as crucial a member of the Beatles as he was. I think part of the thing with him is he didn't play to his strengths. You know, I think John Lennon's strengths really at the end of the day were in pop, whereas he spent his whole solo career basically, with the exception of maybe the last album he did, doing singer-songwriter, and I just don't really think that was his strong suit. And Paul, I think the phrase to use to describe Paul McCartney's solo career is peaks and valleys. Because, oh man, does he have both. So when you, as a Beatles fan, inevitably delve into Paul McCartney's solo career and you start reading about him, you realize that he has a bit of a reputation for not being very good. And there's a very long and very complex history of that basically, a lot of it has very little to do with the music, and it has to do with the critical consensus of the time and the big personalities. Rolling Stone, for example, had this blood feud against him for years because he didn't invite Jan Wenner, who owned the Rolling Stone, to a party in like 1970. The other thing is the fact that while the actual dissolution of the band was mostly on John Lennon, Paul was the one who explained what had happened to the press and who actually formally announced the breakup of the band at the same point that he released his first solo album, McCartney, which is not the kind of solo album that you want to be releasing when your band just put out one of the greatest albums ever released. Don't get me wrong, it's not a bad album, but it's about as far from Abbey Road as you could ever get. And basically the long and the short of it is that first album, coupled with the Beatles breaking up, bought Paul about, I'd say 10 years worth of critical ill will. And basically everything he made in the 70s that wasn't a massive commercial success got completely trashed by the critics. And actually even some of the records he put out that were commercial successes got trashed by the critics. Even though on the whole, his 70s work is actually very, very good. The other half of why people are less likely to look at Paul McCartney's solo stuff favorably comes from the 80s, and while the hate for his 70s work has to do with things that aren't the music, a lot of the hate for his 80s work has everything to do with the music, because first off, he got off the decade with a weird start. So you have McCartney 2, which is way out there, and which, as I understand, was panned at the time, despite it being a very trendy album when you really think about it. I don't know. It's an album I have a lot of personal affection for, even if I will very much admit it is not something you're going to be putting on every day of the week. And then somewhere over the course of the mid-80s, he really lost his way, and ultimately I personally don't think he really found his way again fully until the early 2000s, at which point he began this incredible creative renaissance that in many respects is still going strong in 2019. The album I'm going to be talking about today is what many people consider to be one of the last albums from before he began this sort of creative decline, 1982's Tug of War. This was the triumphant return to form album in many respects. It was where the critical consensus finally came around on him and decided, you know, this Paul McCartney guy's alright. It's also the one that's got Evany and I on it, so there's that. So as soon as the album opens up, I sort of realized that this is kind of a wimpy opening, and it's not like he hasn't had some massive, incredible openings, like Jet from Band on the Run, for example. But this is just kind of there. It's not something I would have pegged as an album opener, and it's kind of a ballsy move to have had it be one. All of my critiques about Tug of War are pretty much immediately dispelled, because really the title track is just an intro to the majesty that is Take It Away. Probably the best song that any former Beatle put out during the 1980s, and one of the very best songs of the entire decade, in my humble opinion. There's a lot to like about the song, the reggae-inflected intro, the energetic verses, and you get these really weird, almost loungy bits that come in. Honestly, I think that's mostly what makes the song special, although it would be great either way. This is not bad, but it's the kind of track that sort of helped to give Paul McCartney his reputation for being very insubstantial. You know, the guy has this wonderful talent for melodies, and I would say the song is a good melody. But it's a nothing lyrically, and it feels, in the context of the album, it feels like it just takes up space. This is the first of 2 Stevie Wonder collaborations on the album, and it's pretty good. It's a little generic funk, but it's a lot of fun, and once it really gets going, it's fantastic. There's a couple of songs in this album, and I mentioned this a little while before on I think on the Oranges and Lemons XTC review. Sometimes a song's intro will just be annoying, but the rest of the song will be fantastic. That's kind of the case here, where I really like it once it starts, but the start puts me off for some reason. But as for me, so here we have the second track that people think is possibly about John Lennon, and it's possible that some of the sentiment is about him, and I think it's probably likely that the sentiment is about him, but actually, lyrically, it seems to be more about lost love than anything else. And while they may have off, I don't think there was anything romantic between them. Ballroom dancing is fun. It's kind of a neat little throwback to the early Beatles days, but it really didn't need to be 4 minutes long. You could shave a minute off of that track and it wouldn't have hurt anybody. So now we go to The Pound is Sinking, probably the second best song on the album after Take It Away. This track is phenomenal, and it's the kind of thing I direct people to when I hear people say that Paul McCartney has no talent. When I first listened to this, my first comparison was Peter Gabriel Genesis, but now that I've listened to it some more, I can honestly say what this reminds me of even more is the track Buckingham Green by Ween off of their 1997 album The Mollusk. And what it reminds me of specifically with regards to Buckingham Green is that this crayons what could easily, in different hands, have been a 7 to 15 minute epic into a barely 3-minute song that just hits everything just perfectly and that you never get bored of. Wanderlust to me is kind of in the same category as Somebody Who Cares, but I like it a lot more, especially because it's just such a pretty song. Especially towards the end when you get the multiple harmonies doing their thing, and it's just a magical moment. Get It is a duet with Carl Perkins of 50s rock fame, and it's a really nice duet. But to me, it kind of clashes with the rest of the album, and it kind of shows what is probably this album's main weakness, which is that it keeps sort of going off on these weird little tangents for a song or two. You know, there's tracks that pretty clearly belong. You know, the title track, Wanderlust, Take It Away, The Pound is Sinking, the trio of songs that end the album. But then you'll get these weird little bits, and usually they're the duet tracks, that feel like they don't really necessarily belong. But that's not true of all the duets, because one of them does fit, but we'll get to that. This is an interlude, but it's a really weird interlude, this ghostly, synthy kind of thing, and I don't really know what it means, and I tend to kind of almost forget that it exists, which I feel bad about saying because it's really striking when you actually listen to it. So the album pretty much ends on a very high note with Dress Me Up Like a Robber, which when I first listened to this album was, along with Take It Away and The Pound is Sinking, sort of the main songs that really drew my attention and made me say, you know, I didn't expect to hear that on a Paul McCartney album. And you know, that's really true. Some of the choices he makes here as far as the melody and sort of the weird sound of it are nothing that I would really expect. And it all comes together for this really fantastically, almost glammy early 80s song. And so the album actually ends with the final duet of the album, Evany and I. And this is one of the most universally mocked songs of all time, and I completely understand why. You know, this is just one of the most banal, trite songs you're ever gonna hear, but I kind of love it, to be honest with you. You know, obviously the lyrics are garbage, you know, the sort of What if we stopped racism by just stopping? You know, that stupid Black or White by Michael Jackson kind of thing that was so popular in the 80s. But the music, I actually really like the music, especially that weird thing in the middle of the song. And now no one will ever watch my channel again because I admitted that I like Evany and Ivory by Stevie Wonder and Paul McCartney. Like all solo Beatles albums, Tug of War is a mixed bag. Some of Paul's greatest songs are on here, and I would easily recommend this as, you know, it's easily one of the 5 McCartney solo albums you need to buy first. In fact, of the actual McCartney solo albums, as opposed to Wings albums, I think it's in the top 3 or 4. But at the same time, you know, there are other things happening that keep me from endorsing it entirely. He goes for the Abbey Road, Dark Side of the Moon, tracks flowing together thing, because which is natural, you know. And in many respects, Paul has spent the rest of his career chasing that Abbey Road sort of flow and that Abbey Road thing, whatever that is. But he doesn't quite recapture it here. Even bringing George Martin back on board, which was a fantastic move, doesn't really achieve that goal. And I think at the end of the day, Band on the Run is still a much more successful album in that sense than this is. But that being said, this is a very good album, and it's an album that definitely needs to be checked out and listened to by anybody who's interested in Paul McCartney in the 80s and, you know, Beatles-ish music actually made by people who were in the Beatles in the 1980s. If you're interested in Beatles-ish music from the 80s that isn't made by people in the Beatles, go listen to XTC. I have several reviews of them on this channel. But as far as Beatle albums from the 80s, it might not quite be the top of the mountain, but it's pretty close, and it's something that you should definitely check out, be it on vinyl or CD or what have you. I don't think you're not going to have trouble finding it on either format, especially because this is one of those albums that a lot of people bought and then decided that they maybe didn't want to have. So the point is, you won't have any trouble finding it. Plus, it's on streaming, which is what most of you cool kids do nowadays anyway. So that was Tug of War. Highly recommend it. Really good album. Yeah, I'm gonna do that Peter Hamill review eventually, but I don't know. It just keeps not happening, and I don't know. I'm just gonna, some point this week I'm gonna force it. It's gonna happen anyway. I will see you guys with that video.